Okay. All right, now that I'm feeling less stressed, but still sweaty. What's the am I talking about? I think with a dysfunctional sensing body about dysfunctional sensing bodies. As a toddler, I got a late diagnosis of sensory integration disorder or sensory processing dysfunction. There's a lot of names. I've always called it sensory integration disorder, so that's what I'm going to call it here today. And I think that the diagnosis made me make sense to my parents. My mom actually sometimes mentions how she's still a little pissed I wasn't diagnosed sooner. I was too young to remember, but I imagine that naming the ways I struggled helped my parents, A, have patience with me, and B, get me help and get them help helping me. They would drop me off in these occupational therapy clinics in big industrial parks, a weird place for a doctor's office, but they needed double or triple high ceilings for the swings. My personal issues were and are with my vestibular system, or my gyroscope, which tells me which way is up, especially with my eyes closed. So I had to go on big swings, and I would shut my eyes and clench my muscles tight and not breathe, and feel nauseous and scared, maybe hear my heartbeat in my ears, accidentally dig my nails into my palms and curl into the kind of fetal position where if you go tight enough, you might actually slip inside yourself. At home, music was everything. Both of my parents were music therapists, so improvisation was just woven into the fabric of life since forever. And I spent a lot of time just kind of sitting with the piano and then the cello. It gave me something to be good at. I've been thinking about how, as a kid, cultivating a relationship with these instruments was my own sort of sensory integration therapy. I could inhabit the feedback loops of physical actions and their sonic consequences that could, in turn, trigger physical actions again. Playing new music was a place to practice certain basic neurological reflexes and build up muscle memory and just practice paying attention to my obstinate body. I could push my own boundaries in a way that felt safe. I could work myself up to the point of dissociation and learn about its onset and stretching, and mostly how to just occupy it. It's hard to say whether you can actually practice being dissociated. I'm curious what you guys think. There are some great little examples of sensory dysfunction that illustrate how common it is and some of the affects and effects associated with it. For example, what makes you seasick are conflicting accounts of physical orientation from your vision and from your vestibular organs. Sight is oriented to the horizon, while vestibular sensing, being fluid-based, is oriented to gravity. So looking at the distant horizon helps with motion sickness by aligning the two senses. As I mentioned earlier, your vestibular sense tells you where you're at with your eyes closed. But more specifically, it registers angular acceleration. It reports how you're moving, forward, back, left, right, and spinning as well. The best way to explain it is by doing it. If you guys would hold your index finger in front of your face like this. I don't need to read my description, I can just describe it. Wag no. Try and look at your finger. It's blurry. Probably. Okay, stop. Now we're going to shake our head no, same speed, and look at our finger. Less blurry. You're saying yes, but continuing to shake your head, right? Cool. That's a good, I'm going to write that joke. What's happening is that when you move your finger, your vision is feeding your eyeballs tracking reflex. And when you're shaking your head, your vestibular organs were feeding your tracking reflex. And your vestibular reflexes are much faster than your visual ones. Seasickness is an example of the physiological response to their decorrelation on a larger scale. The experience or symptoms of this sensory conflict or neural mismatch involved in motion sickness is nausea. And nausea is relatable because lots of modern life induces it in normal people. The way people overcome motion sickness is just habituation. You go on a boat a lot, which works. You can learn to discriminate between autonomic reflexes. And you can learn how to be uncomfortable, or maybe just learn how to do things while you're uncomfortable. Really, the ambiguity of function teaches you how to improvise and adapt from the neurological reflexive level up into propulsive action. Now, as I'm increasingly pressed to articulate my compositional strategy and intellectual commitments, I guess I'm not surprised that I'm drawn to thinking about action theory and sensory pathologies as compositional strategies and therefore aesthetic practices. Aesthetic, after all, comes from aesthesis, to make available to the senses. And its negation is anesthetic, the dulling of the faculties. This attracts me to medical and scientific literature, not as the answer to a question, but as a starting point. It also attracts me to phenomenological thinking, because I like to bond with folks through our experience of nausea and fatigue. It also attracts me to epistemology, the study of knowledge. Making sense of things 101, at least according to Aristotle and then like so many other people, is that things are, for argument's sake, defined by what they do or how they behave. The aspects of things that are available to us are tied to what we can do with them or them to us. What it do might be the best definition of it. We could flip it and ask, do we need reasons for doing things? Or really, in all seriousness, are we doing things for a reason? It's totally possible that the imperative is just action and that reasons get made up along the way in order to organize and perpetuate action itself. There's this theory of consciousness that I like a lot, which kind of thinks about evolution, where like there's this odd symmetry to as biological forms evolve, the amount of motor neurons and sensory neurons always expand in kind. There's not examples of biological beings that have kind of imbalance of the two. You have a lot, you have a lot, you have a little, you have a little. And the thinking is behind that is that basically if you're a mollusk, or if you're a cell, right, your whole world is just local to you. Something is at your surface and you have to make a decision in that moment of contact about whether you want to eat it, or fuck it, or run away from it, right? That's like your three options and you need to decide immediately. And that's the kind of logic that a nervous system takes care of, right? It's reflexive. And as evolution takes place in higher orders of life, start to get access to things that are just further away, right? No longer just at our surface. We have to develop the ability to wait to eat it or fuck it or run away from it. We have to be like, oh, it's over there, I gotta wait till it gets here. Or it's over there, maybe I should walk that way and intersect it. And so kind of time arises, but also like the horizon of the world, if you will, or something, gets built up out of these need-based relations to things that are available kind of just as far as they're useful to us or a threat to us. That's a problematic and complicated myth of kind of consciousness, but it's, I think, a cool example of this kind of problem. I didn't write that part out. In any case, it's a bummer to be broken. Illness can be simply defined as apraxia, the condition of incapacity. When something loses its purpose or function, or its use, or its meaning, or whatever we want to call it, it's actually really hard to understand the thing. It's a bit of a language trick or a mind game to try and think about an object that doesn't do anything, because it invites the slippage of what can be called an action at all, which is cool. Because the possibility of sensory dysfunction describes exactly the condition where your senses of things and their function gets distorted as you become disoriented, it becomes hard to tell where things are, and it becomes hard to do things. I'm interested in the edges of sensory dysfunction as sites of composition, where the messiness of action and perception reframes normative relationships between art and life. All right, next section. I recently came across a paper called Action as Abductive Performance, an Improvisational Model. And it gives a good description of this compositional strategy at the margins of sensory dysfunction. It situates abductive reason up against the classical forms of judgment, deduction and induction. Deduction is making an inference from a given set of premises or rules. It's top down. You know X equals Y equals Z, so therefore you know X equals Z. Or that dogs are cute and have 4 legs and bark, and so when you see a cute 4-legged barker, you know from the rules of the category of dog that this is one. Deduction yields necessary inferences. That is, if your premises are true, your inferences always are too. Induction is the process of developing premises, induction is the process of developing premises, basically. It's how one figures out the rules through observation. So bottom up. Like if you don't know what a dog is, but you find yourself at a dog park, and know it's called a dog park, and you see all these cute 4-legged barkers running around, you can do a statistical analysis that the barkers are in fact the dogs. Induction yields non-necessary inferences insofar as the truth value should be good until it's not. Finally, we have abduction, which uses the prefix ab to be taken out. Abduction is what you do when you have incomplete information and unreliable premises. It's a best fit model where the inferences necessarily negate some of the premises. Because if they didn't, it would just be deduction or induction. Say you know it's true that your friends Bill and Ted, who were together for years, recently broke up. Then, one day, you see Bill and Ted sitting together, laughing and having fun. The assumption is that Bill and Ted got back together, even though there's no statistical proof, and even though it undoes a core premise of Bill and Ted's relationship and identity and purpose. The most formal use of abduction in the scientific method is in the creation of hypotheses. Put crudely, scientists compare a bunch of best guesses and then pick the best guess. According to disease realism, which is a crazy set of words, sensory integration disorder and autism are technically syndromes and not full-blown diseases, as they remain a collection of correlated symptoms or apraxias, without a unifying hypothesis or cause. Syndromes are pathologically stranded in abductive terrain. In the theoretical application, abduction constitutes the leap into language from phenomena. That's an intense sentence, isn't it? But I think it's like this translation of like...
Can you say it again?
Yeah. In the theoretical application, abduction constitutes the leap into language from phenomena. So it's the kind of like almost invisible work of connecting Rachel to you or something for me. Yeah, so a syndrome is where you haven't identified the cause, right? And so there's a lot of situations historically where researchers, like the researcher who discovered sensory integration disorder, right, was a computer programmer who volunteered in schools and noticed a bunch of kids who had dysfunction, but didn't know why, right? And then starts organizing symptoms of just like being bad at stuff. So she designed a battery of like, I think 70 tests of just doing simple things, took all that data and ran mathematical correlations that still resulted in no like underlying cause, right? And that's true of autism, and it's true of a couple different things where there's not like oh, it's a malady of the liver, we treat the liver and the symptoms will be gone. It's always a set of symptoms. which is also really important to understanding the movement towards like neurodiversity as opposed to like disease, right? Because it refuses a certain curative logic. It's like a set of symptoms that can be understood as a way of being, as opposed to something to be cured. Should I keep going?
Sure.
Okay. The thinkers of abduction go further and assert that abduction is actually the condition of possibility for deduction and induction. Put super bluntly, the idea is that the leap from sensual experience into language is abductive reason itself. Good, I explain it more. That's important. That the abstraction of seeing something to describing it is an abductive process. That means that basically all action, even the action associated with purpose, is always abductive in the specificity of an actual moment. For example, even if this talk is pre-composed, my activity of writing it, of picking the words and sequencing the arguments, are an accumulation of abductive actions that in retrospect appear as purposive, rational, linear composition. While writing, I was constrained by and responding to the particular situated material reality of every moment. You know, I was more tired, or more thirsty, or more stoned, or whatever at a given time. I could remember or forget. Right, it's kind of the other two reasons suppose that this completeness of information that doesn't really square with my experience of like knowing all possible things and making a decision based on my knowledge of all possible things. We're going to reel it in a second, I swear. The connection between abduction and improvisation starts to become clear here. It's the familiar feeling when the reasons and purposes of actions and forms get loosened up in process. It can be terror, and it can be invention. When there are uncountable reasons to make up this or that decision with no possibility of complete information that could lead to correctly true inferences. There is always a gap for unknowing and whimsy and taste and accident and inspiration and distraction and spirit to come out of nowhere and hijack everything. The other meaning of abduction is this flip side of escape. Both are fantasies of total removal, to get out. The crucial difference is that with abduction, the actor or agency is located external to a sense of self. It's outrageously problematic to theorize abduction without thinking about sexual violence, enslavement, and all forms of terrorism. That being said, the idea of being captured is also intrinsic to transcendentalism and endemic to conversations about artistic and spiritual, that is, aesthetic and ascetic practices. Attention is captured. You are taken by spirit. The most sublime sort of metaphysical hijacking comes from out of nowhere and against your will. Like Jonah running from God, or love at first sight, or a medium who forgets her messages. An undeniable transcendent abduction initiated from somewhere totally outside your control. Then you have the artists and ascetics who desire their own abduction and do their best to create the conditions to be possessed. Ascetic because practices of channeling or visitation often demand an emptying out of self. You have to leave yourself behind or let yourself go to make room for inspiration. Even the most mundane, familiar reality of feeling tired and whacked out and just wanting some energy to get through the moment locates the point of initiation and event of abduction outside yourself, even if that outside is the opacity of your own metabolism. Which is to say, when you're hoping to be taken by spirit or inspiration or clarity, there is a supplication involved, and therefore an action and a clear sense of self and initiation as well as the recognition of other. But is the desire for someone or something else to take control, and moreover the creation of the conditions for them to, itself an act of control? It could equally be articulated as a negation, like weakness or dysfunction, that produces the possibility of abduction. To really articulate the desire to be abducted by an unknowable possibility, you need to be prepared to relinquish the attachment to your desire, making it impossible to desire to be interceded on in the first place. To practice abduction in both this kind of theological sense and the rational one and the improvisational one means to somehow be prepared for something more uncomfortable and more unknowable in the extreme. And I'm not sure that's something you can actually want. Abstractly wanting change feels accessible, but I'm not sure I can actually desire this sort of total void. It requires a more passive verb. Maybe it becomes yielding. This relational choreography of yielding, I think, is crucial. Navigating sensory dysfunction is kind of like yielding to experience, knowing when to quit. Abductive, embodied illogics. It's also the opposite, having the world yield to you through experience. Sensory stimuli tend to just present themselves to you, whether you like it or not. Does light yield itself up to our eyes or warmth to our skin? Thinking about sensory experiences or things as yielding to me as I yield to them feels like a productive way forward. It explains the possibility of sensory overwhelm as something other than lack. It helps explain the possibility of improvement and health without relying on the overdetermination of curative logic. Like you can get better at doing the dance, but the music is always different and partners always change. And that's exactly the sort of praxis pocket that abductive reason fills. Rehearsing irregularities regularly as a rehearsal for the irregular. So punchy, right though? Come on. Rehearsing irregularities regularly as a rehearsal for the irregular. What? Thank you. Maybe subtitle. It's easy and nice to be rigid. People don't like their plans to change. Being open and receptive to a change in the rules is scary. Being willing to identify and address your assumptions about the world is not nice. To practice improvisation as abductive reason means to cultivate this very particular posture of yielding. In this spirit, as we segue into the workshop portion of tonight, I want to invite a yes and of being both willing to be taken and changed and willing to be greedy and to do what you want and take what you want and to sit with the possibility of both of those things inside at least the container of this moment. Please hijack the conversation. If you want to try something, tell us. If someone's playing an instrument and you're compelled to also be playing the instrument, try and take it and we'll figure it out. I've prepared a series of games that we'll play together, if you want. But before we get into all that, I want to open the floor for any questions, comments, witticisms, or criticisms from anybody about any of this. Wow, it's like this thing that needs to be popped right in front of us.
I just want to mention just like as like the pedagogy of like abducting and like that type of thing, or that type of process and the margin of error is so intrinsic to these instruments. And one of the major things that Anarchestra does is we do in school and after school programs. And in the spring we did a program at Fallon in Pawtucket. So we did a program at Fallon Elementary where we brought instruments, and it was just me and another person essentially like trying to introduce these kids to these instruments. And then we did a 4-week program in the summer. It was really similar. And a lot of the kids, A, didn't speak English, And so, like, there was this other added negotiation of like what we were doing and what I was presenting them with. But also it wasn't just teaching, it wasn't just presenting musical instruments and to people who you can't communicate with well. It's presenting things that aren't even musical instruments that they would know even if they could speak the same languages.
Right.
So there's this like, and like no one really, especially if you're 8, but also if you're like 30, there aren't a ton of easy reference points for any of these instruments. There's like a few passing ones. Some of them like are like a bass, some of them are like a harp. But as soon as you are interacting with them, you recognize that they actually totally resist categorization and become a reflection of whatever they become like a bare apparatus for your inferences about them.
Right.
And
Bare
so,
apparatus for injury.
Yeah, injury too, yeah. But also just what people project as the instruments they know or the music they've seen.
Right.
So this is just, I guess, this is in good context.
I'm curious what, like, when you wrote that grant, what was like the outcome measurement or whatever that you convinced the school board the kids would be learning from that experience?
We told, I think we told them that it would be, we would teach Rhode Island youth that they're all musicians. It was a humanities project too, so we were like, we're going to put the idea of musicianship in the hands of people who don't have a context of music. And a lot of the schools that we were in did not have a music program, which is crazy. Like, this was the music program that these like kindergartners and fifth graders were getting without any other context, like without like the nylon string guitars that like, whatever Wheeler has.
Right.
But like, no disrespect. No, but like this being the first encounter with music making is a really, really kind of psychedelic thing.
Yeah.
If you're like 5 and Cape Verde and those people.
Right. And there's like an intensely, almost radical attachment of just being like, this is music, both on the like funding structure and on the like for the kid.
Yeah, and also it's like because it's all amplified. It's literally empowering. Like it literally is. The power is so potent. It's so condensed within the plucking of a string. It's immediately really, really loud. And also in music rooms, we were always in a gymnasium,
Right.
like a huge gymnasium. So people who play these instruments, they would be outrageously loud.
Wow, I want to
Come along.
Can you just talk about, sensory stuff? Can you just talk about sound as like a sensory experience versus or different from other sensory experiences in any way that you would put that question? Sensory sound.
Does anyone else want to take that? You want to take it in the back?
I was kidding.
Um,
You should take it.
I try and not play into like sense exceptionalism. Even though I was at a talk about the smelling the other day and noticed that I was like, this is by far the least important sense.
I
thought COVID got everyone on board on scent.
was gonna
Yeah,
say.
those sort of
Because like everyone lost their smell. They're like, you don't know if the house is burning down. Hold on.
I guess
The only way you can know the house is burning down is if you can smell.
Right.
Yeah, not as compared to.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I could rap about whatever. I guess I feel like I've lately been trying to think about like just how wildly different the just like mechanisms of the different senses are, and kind of just to underline the absurdity of their like an assumed integration of them. Right? It's like the mechanism by which sound is translated has to do with volumes of space and air and this like weird twisty thing, and it's like this like air-based thing. And then your inner ear, which is like right next to it, your bony labyrinth, is like this fluid-filled like all these fluid and nipple-filled pockets that, as it sloshes around, tells you where you're going. And then those two things are like as organs adjacent to each other and producing some kind of like integrated picture of what's happening. And the fact that that doesn't always work out is like, oh, well, yeah, you know? And so, yeah, I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, it's just interesting that sound in that physical way is all about balance. It's like, you know, it's like the ear stuff is the balance stuff.
Right, well, there are these two organs that are like coupled, but not directly implicated in each other, which is also crazy.
Yeah.
This literal sensing organs for like balance, right, weren't like discovered or studied until the turn of the century. Right? It's like 1904. They're like, oh, we have a whole organ in sense that we didn't talk about. Because it was so buried inside of the hearing apparatus, they just assumed that it was part hearing. But they're actually unrelated in like mechanical function. Yeah. And yeah, I love sound. Yeah.
Okay, not at all to answer the question because I'm not a sound guy. But your talk was reminding me of talks we've had before about like agency in the senses, where like I was in a class and talking about like how when you're seeing stuff, you can shut your eyes and stop seeing it, or you can be like, I'm gonna look there instead of looking here or here. But sound like inflicts itself on you atmospherically, and you can't just like shut it down the same way. And I was thinking about motion sickness.
I can't hear you right now.
But it's not like an inbuilt mechanism.
Right. You can't just like shut it.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about motion sickness and how like you're sick, you feel like shit, you're like, I'm just gonna be in the backseat of this car or on this boat and I'm gonna shut my eyes and I'm gonna feel better. But it doesn't work the other way around. You can't be like, oh, I'm gonna make my vestibular organs not sense motion right now, but I'm gonna keep my eyes open and look at whatever the fuck I want.
Yeah.
So there is this kind of like different agential attachment to vision versus other things that are deep inside your bony labyrinth and not just your eyeballs looking at stuff.
Yeah, for sure. I guess that's kind of like the context also for thinking about this gesture of yielding, where it's like when you can't shut it down, and you want it to, there's like, or what even are the sorts of desires that you're reduced to during sensory dysfunction? Are those sorts of desires or some kind of reflex? Or is there decision making happening in that? And then like, if you're nauseous and you nothing you can do about it, are you gonna die or are you gonna just let it be there and be nauseous? Kind of reflects the question. I don't know, I'm not used to this. Is there a question in the back?
Yeah, how are you defining yielding? So you talked a lot about how with sensory stimuli, like light or warmth, it yields to you and you yield to it. But I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. Sometimes I feel like I'm being bombarded by stimulus and I have no chance but to respond to it. Sometimes I wish I had the ability to yield to it, or even more kindly it to yield to me, but maybe my definition of yield is different than yours. So I was really...
No, I mean, that is like all exactly the problem.
Okay.
Yeah, I feel like it's...
So you're saying that it doesn't yield?
I'm saying that it's kind of like a choreography of yielding that includes the possibility of its failure, right? Where it's like, there's the frustration of not receiving or the frustration of being bombarded, and like ideally one gets used to yielding to situations that you can't control or something like that, and like accept,
So by yielding, do you mean like slowing down for, giving way to?
word. The source that inspired me to that word was I was reading like theological texts about yielding to God, basically, right? Which I didn't want to get too deep into here, but it's like this, there's an Anne Carson essay called Decreation, where she talks about this like 13th century mystic named Marguerite Porete, who was burned at the stake for this heretical account of her like radical love of God. And she was obsessed with this problematic of yielding, where she had the desire to fully yield herself to God, and then is driven mad by the realization that if she were to fully yield to God, she would lose the desire or ability to yield at all, right? And then from that, there's actually all these really cool like prepositions that come out that prefigure a lot of like, I think, Black feminist discourse and like materialist discourse now, where she decides that the solution is to be alongside God, or and like with God, as opposed to like somehow, facing. So that's kind of the inspiration, is this and then at the same time I really like how it's a word that like defeats itself, right? Like it contains the possibility of like overwhelm, that's like not doing anymore. Like yielding is something that you do, but also something that kind of like maybe happens? I don't know.
No, because I was thinking like yielding in traffic, like
Word.
a polite sign where
I hadn't even thought of like the obvious.
Yeah. Like words like that, but okay, no, but that
Yeah.
makes actually a lot more sense.
Thank you for that.
It's a decentering of itself in the action.
Right. And so like the following chapter would be like thinking about ecstasy, basically, right? Which is like in these religious accounts, it's the standing outside of yourself that like produces this like dynamic of the sublime, and I want to go to like the nauseous sublime or something like that.
Is that in some sense what you're speaking to when you're talking about the abduction in sort of in the spiritual sort of transcendent sense? Because I was tripping over that a little bit, but I think if I do it through that lens that we were just talking about, then maybe I can.
Yeah.
Just there.
Yeah. Thinking about like these kind of situations where there's like accounts of being taken outside of yourself, as similar to the kind of like fracturing of self that happens inside of like sensory dysfunction and confusion, right? It's like, or as like but there's so much stuff that wants to think about the like a network sense of being, right? Where it's like, I'm not just like a body, but I'm exist in relationship, I'm many things, which is all nice and good, but hard to actually think about what that feeling is. And so thinking about like ways into what that like might effectively be like.
I think your way of thinking about yielding is really lovely, and I think about that all the time, specifically in the frame of like physical exercise. If it's like if it's uncomfortable or if it's not pleasant, there's like, I find that I like reach a point, maybe like a certain amount of time in, where I decide pretty actively to yield to whatever is uncomfortable about it, and then I can enter this kind of like flow. What I kind of wanted to like ask you about, I guess, is that I find that in yielding to one sense, I might ground myself in a different sense. So like, if I'm running, let's say, and the sunlight is like bearing down on me, then to focus on the rhythm of your feet on the ground or your breathing can ground you if you're feeling like there's a lot of noise around you or there's something irritating going on. In terms of light or sound, then to focus on your breathing or to focus your eyes on a piece of media or something can take you out of it. So,
Totally.
is there such a thing, I guess? I don't know if this is like super abstract and like, baseless, I guess. But is there such a thing as fully yielding to everything at once?
Bueller?
Is anyone here?
I don't know. What you're saying though reminds me a lot of one of like the most important, another one of the really important like underlying thinkers for this for me, who's someone named Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, who started the body-mind centering. We got some nods. She's mama to a lot of like somatic practice. Like widely published in the Contact Improv Quarterly, so it's kind of like in this moment in the 70s where people are thinking about consciousness and embodiment and practice like in the same place. And she has this thing that sounds so out there, she calls it cellular consciousness, which at first is like, yo. But she's talking about what you're saying, which is like, there's a really deeply familiar experience of drawing our attention into different parts and functions of the body. Right? Like this is like maybe the simplest, stupid thing where it's like you touch your fingers together, you can like do it from the perspective of your right finger, and you can feel from the perspective of your left finger. And they're not mutually exclusive, and they're possible, and you can feel both at the same time. And Bonnie's point is that the function, like macro function, is determined by cellular function, right? So like the sorts of structures that make up your skin on your fingertips, the reason it's that structure is because of the cells that come together to produce that structure. And so that there's actually this kind of like built-in proliferation of cellular consciousnesses that we, in like a really banal way, have access to. And I just love that because it is like another one of these examples of the like, you know, it's like proliferation of self. That's not like this kind of like distant theoretical object.
What's her name?
Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen.
Well, I could say it's like, yeah, specifically what you're talking about with the running thing, and I think this is true for all things. It's like the thing that happens when you're running, right, is there's a transitory state where like you're uncomfortable before you've like fully immersed in your discomfort.
Word.
Same as like doing hot yoga. If you're like on the verge of sweating, you're like, oh, I hate this. But once you've like been in hot yoga for like half an hour and you're fully drenched in sweat, you're just like, this is who I am.
Word.
And like the same thing can happen aesthetically, where you're like, when you're in a transitory period, you're uncomfortable. But once you've fully immersed in that discomfort, it can once again become extremely comfortable. And I think,
That is all I tried to say all day.
cool.
That's the thing about like with noise music. Like I remember like that's like when you're like trying to play like really loud music to your parents. Like, for example, maybe you've made noise music and you're trying to offer it to your parents, and they're like squinting through it and they're like, oh, it's so I'm trying to hear through it. And people like the only barrier, that the only reason that like music can be inaccessible and that it can be forbidding or challenging is just because people assume and project that there's something that they have to work through and to get to something, and that it's uncomfortable.
You haven't fully given yourself.
That if you actually just open your ears,
Yeah.
your ears won't resist no sounds. Like if you open your ears to a high-pitched frequency instead of trying to split them because it's too high, you'll find that it's like it fills your ears.
Transcendental.
Yeah.
Which could also describe meditation, right?
Right.
It's like,
Yeah, or like coming up out of that situation.
yeah.
Or play.
Yeah.
You want to play?
Yeah.
Asher wants to play.
Who wants
Any
to play?
quick questions before we play? There's a burning question right here.
Man, don't all come and like turn back at me. Okay, this is like not a quick one, and I've been sitting on it for too long, so do you just not want to do it?
Why don't we put it in the air?
What is it?
And then we'll think about it together.
Well, it's okay, so somebody who has an autism diagnosis like way later on in life, like out of high school, like autism diagnosis.
Yeah.
I find that I have a really hard time categorizing like my sensory discomfort with things that aren't of the like social emotional world around me that I don't understand. Wherein like I can't be like, oh, XYZ thing, like the tag's rubbing on my back, or somebody's like interrogating too much of me, or it's too loud in here, or I can't focus my eyes on something, or I feel nauseous or dizzy. Like the first thing that comes to me, because I've been masking my whole life, is like I'm in an emotional or social situation that I don't know how to react to, and that's what's making me uncomfortable. And that's why I'm not able to like fully yield myself to my discomfort, to my sensory overwhelm, because I'm sitting and like categorizing things in a way that's like essentially exactly like not taking the essence of what's really like going on inside of me in any like given circumstance, because I've been told to like this is how you have to function in neurotypical society, like this is how it is. And I was wondering if like you had similar issues with in that context, not necessarily in that like specific context, but in similar ones with like improvising with other people, where like I feel like I can't, and it makes me really anxious to do this at times. Like I don't feel like I only recently got into a way of like improvising with people that feels good to me, and that's with like the person I love very much, so it feels very easy. But having this like inability to traverse the vast social expanse that exists like in between us, and like the etiquette that might like be there, but also like not, because I'm so obsessed with this thing that is like happening while we're playing that has nothing to do with what we're playing, but also everything to do with what we're playing at the same time. Like not being able to yield myself to doing the thing in a way that like feels right to me, or sometimes to them, like constantly feeling as though I'm like creating faux pas because I'm unable to say or articulate in any kind of way like what I'm feeling to the umpteenth degree that's supposed to be like what music is, like real as hell. Like this is supposed to be the real thing that's going on. I'm being incredibly inarticulate, but regardless, like there being a huge gap between like me and other people in terms of improv, despite it's supposed to be like the thing. Like this is like the impulse, like and you're supposed to be playing off the other person. Like I feel like when people don't have those similar like difficulties with like sensory experience, it's really hard for me to like level with them on that. And I wonder if
totally. I feel like so much to say, but just to underline two little things, I feel like there's this like the failure of the thing that we're talking about, this kind of like liberatory potential, just leaves you disappointingly with yourself. And then at the same time, what you're saying is like the container of, to not beat around the bush, love produces the possibilities, certain possibilities, and without trust, like there's like some kind of dance between trust and control and holding that, we're gonna all struggle with forever.
And like also with contact improv too being like so, like I'll talking about like trust in terms of any type of improv, like contact improv having to hinge like a lot on consent, like who's allowed to touch your body and how that should not just like how the impulse exists there, but you're also like contained within your own being and in charge of who can touch you where and when. And that like now you're having to interact with another person in the space in a way where like their impulses are unpredictable to you.
Totally.
So.
I mean, I feel like ideally that's the, hopefully we've built enough of a container to try some of that in about, do we want a 10-minute break? To like, so my idea now, taking back the reins. My idea now is to take about 10 minutes to get up out of our chairs and walk around and touch these things, which I have yet to mention. But I'm thinking about these things as our kind of like garden to play with these dynamics. Or not, whatever, okay? Let's take about 5-10 minutes. I'll know that we're done when it seems like folks have situated themselves with instruments that they're going to play in our first thing. Okay? If you gotta head out, that makes lots of sense too. I think we need a break, but when we come back, we'll get situated, and what we'll do first is the same sounding out exercise that we did when we came in with our voices and bodies with the instruments, and then we'll move into a tuning exercise, And then if no one has hijacked the proceedings by then, I have a couple other games planned, but, make sense? Okay, see you in 10.